What is the true value of a single dollar? For most people, it is loose change at the bottom of a pocket, not even enough for a cup of coffee. Yet in some moments it can weigh more than gold, a symbol that carries humiliation or possibility depending on how it is given. Emily Carter never expected her life to turn on a single bill. She was a waitress in Washington, D.C., working late nights under chandeliers that glowed like a stage set, serving people who lived in a world she had once dreamed of joining. Years earlier, she had worn a flight suit and strapped into the cockpit of a T-6 Texan II, training to become a United States Air Force pilot. She had learned how to run pre-flight checks, practice emergency landings, and trust the discipline drilled into her by instructors who demanded precision in every maneuver. But those days ended when her parents died, and she became the only guardian for her younger sister. Dreams of flight gave way to long shifts on aching feet. The restaurant where she worked was one of the city's most exclusive. The carpets muted every step and the air smelled of wine older than she was. Her role was to glide unseen, balancing trays with practiced control, while hiding exhaustion behind a polite smile. On this night, the host pulled her aside with a whisper. "Table 12, he said. A reservation under the name Blackwell. Do not make a mistake." Emily straightened her shoulders and nodded. She approached the private alcove where two men waited. One was loud, flashing a Rolex, speaking before she even set down the menus. The other was silent, older, his presence heavy. This was Richard Blackwell, a billionaire who rarely appeared in public. His eyes followed her with unsettling focus. Not unkind, but sharp, the way an instructor watches a student under pressure. Dinner passed in a blur of expensive orders and small humiliations. The loud man boasted of deals and power. Blackwell spoke little, tasting his food slowly, his gaze returning to Emily each time she poured water or cleared a plate. When dessert was declined, she carried the leather folder to the table. Blackwell signed without hesitation. She waited for the moment every server dreamed of, the legendary tip that could change a month of bills. Her fingers touched the folder. It felt light. Inside was the total for several $1,000s and a crisp $1 bill resting on top. The room tilted. The sound of the dining room faded. Emily stood frozen, staring at the insult. The smallest bill in the currency of a man worth billions. A single dollar. It was a gesture so deliberate, it burned. Emily's apartment was a narrow space on the edge of the city, its walls lined with overdue notices and folders of medical paperwork. The kitchen table was buried under envelopes marked urgent, prescriptions stacked beside half-empty bottles of generic pain relievers. She kept the place as tidy as she could, but the weight of responsibility pressed on every corner. Her younger sister slept in the next room, her breathing shallow and uneven. Each new bill was another reminder that Emily's dreams had been set aside so survival could take their place. She would return from shifts after midnight, feet sore, shoulders aching from carrying trays. The apartment's quiet was both comfort and prison. She sat at the table and opened her laptop, scrolling through payment plans and appeals denied. The numbers never added up. Each month she fell further behind. She thought about how once, at exactly 7:15 a.m., her mornings began with a checklist on the flight line instead of a double shift at the restaurant. Her mind drifted back to training days, when she strapped into the T-6 Texan II under the watchful eyes of her instructors. She remembered the smell of jet fuel, the headset pressing against her ears, the feel of the control stick in her gloved hand. One drill stood out. A simulated engine failure where she had to glide the aircraft into an emergency landing. She ran through the procedures calmly, trimming the nose, scanning for a field, keeping her voice steady as she called out each step. The Texan touched down smoothly and her instructor nodded once, a rare show of approval. That moment proved she had the skill and the discipline to fly. to carry the responsibility of life and machine in her hands. Now, years later, those instincts of control and precision were wasted on balancing serving trays and rationing paychecks. She folded another bill and placed it in the pile, a small act of order in a life that had lost direction. She still carried the training in her posture, in the way she faced each obstacle without complaint. Yet in the dim light of her apartment, the gap between what she had been prepared to do and what she was forced to accept felt crushing. Discipline had not failed her. Circumstance had. The news spread through the staff like wildfire. A billionaire had left Emily a single dollar, and whispers followed her each time she crossed the dining room. Some co-workers laughed under their breath. Others watched her with pity, waiting for her to break. One leaned in at the server station and muttered that it was colder than the walk-in freezer. The manager stormed over, face red, demanding to see the billfold. After a long look, he shook his head and said, "Men like that lived in another world, and she should not take it personally." His words did nothing to ease the sting. Emily stood still in the service hall, the dollar in her hand feeling heavier than steel. She remembered how in flight training instructors drilled her to remain calm no matter the emergency, to think before reacting. That lesson returned now. The humiliation burned, but she refused to let it dictate her next move. She sat at the counter in the break area, unfolded the signed receipt, and pulled out a pen from her apron. Her hand trembled as she began to write. She did not write anger. Instead, she wrote that a dollar could carry meaning depending on how one used it. It could feed a hungry person or remind someone that even small acts had weight. Her words were steady, her handwriting neat, each sentence shaped with care. She signed her name and added the line that she was more than a waitress, that she was the artist who once fixed something broken. It was not a plea and it was not sarcasm. It was her way of reclaiming her dignity. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully and tucked it back inside. Later, as the restaurant emptied, she slipped the customer copy into her bag. On her way out, she stopped by the front desk and quietly asked for the company's mailing address. She told the host she needed to ensure the record reached the office, nothing more. At 2:30 a.m., she walked into the night, the city lights sharp in the cold air, and decided she would mail the envelope in the morning. Emily had taken an insult and reshaped it into a statement. The dollar would not define her. Her response would. The envelope was gone, mailed that morning after her shift, and for days Emily checked the mailbox like a ritual. Each time she hoped to see something with the company's logo, a letter, any sign that her words had been read. Instead, there was only silence, and the weight of it grew heavier with each sunrise. She kept moving, because there was no other choice. At 7:15 a.m., she woke her sister for school, packed a simple lunch, then rushed to the bus stop before heading to another long shift. The restaurant was the same blur of footsteps, trays, and forced smiles. Her co-workers stopped asking if she had heard back, sensing the tension in her silence. At closing, when the last table was cleared, she sat in the break room staring at her phone, waiting for an email that never came. Exhaustion pressed on her shoulders, yet she carried it without complaint. The unspoken truth was that her patience was thinning. One night, as she folded laundry in her small apartment, her mind drifted to the Air Force range. She remembered the weight of the M4 carbine, the repetition of loading, aiming, firing, clearing, then doing it all again. The instructors demanded precision. Safety on, magazine seated, bolt forward, finger off the trigger until ready to fire. At first her shots scattered, wide and uneven, but they taught her that consistency mattered more than instant success. She learned to breathe, reset, and trust the process. That lesson had stayed with her long after she left training. She had seen how discipline was not about perfection in a single moment, but about showing up each time, no matter how frustrating the wait. Now, she tried to hold on to that same mindset. The silence from the company was its own kind of target, one that refused to move or acknowledge her. Each day she tried to steady her breathing and keep her focus, but it was harder outside the structure of the uniform. By the end of the week, the silence no longer felt like oversight. It felt deliberate. She sat at her kitchen table late at night, bills spread out before her, the sound of her sister's breathing faint in the next room. The frustration pressed deep, threatening to crack the patience she once wore like armor. Emily whispered to herself that discipline was tested most when nothing came back, and she realized she was living inside that test now. At 9:30 a.m., Richard Blackwell sat in his office high above the city. The skyline stretched like a silent kingdom at his feet. The envelope had been delivered by his assistant, and now the signed receipt with Emily's note rested on his desk. He had read it once, then again, and by the third time the ink seemed to press heavier on the page. His reputation was built on control. He gave little away in his face, his voice always measured, his decisions ruthless but efficient. Yet the words written in her careful hand unsettled him. She had not begged or cursed. She had written about kindness, about value, and about the weight of choices. The message was simple, but it pierced a place he thought long buried. The $1 tip had never been an accident. He had left it as a measure, a way to see who would fold under insult and who would hold steady. He told himself it was a test of character, a ritual of sorts, though few ever knew it was deliberate. Most broke or lashed out. She had not. Instead, she had sent her reply directly to the top floor, and now it was staring back at him in silence. Blackwell leaned back in his chair, the city lights blinking faintly against the glass behind him. He remembered the first time he saw the algorithm that changed his life. It had been decades earlier, a system designed by an Air Force engineer for aircraft resupply operations. The model calculated how to move spare parts and fuel with precision, predicting failures before they happened, keeping squadrons in the air when they should have been grounded. It was brilliance born from service, meant for national defense. That engineer had been Emily's father. Blackwell had not stolen it in the shadows. He acquired it through contracts and loopholes, through legal signatures and buried clauses. But he knew what it really was. It was the foundation of his empire, stripped from a man who never saw the fortune it would build. He told himself it was business. Yet every now and then, when he saw the name Rowe on an old briefing paper or a quiet reminder in defense records, guilt pressed harder than profit. Now, with Emily's note on his desk, that guilt was no longer quiet. He read her words once more, his hand resting on the paper longer than it should. The city still looked the same outside his window, but for the first time in years, Blackwell felt the weight of what it meant to build a tower on someone else's foundation. At 10:15 a.m., Emily opened her mailbox and found an envelope heavier than the rest. The paper was thick, embossed with the name of a law firm she had never heard before. Inside, a letter with perfect spacing and precise wording invited her to meet attorney Evelyn Reed in the city. She sat in the waiting area 2 days later, her hands resting on her knees as the glass walls rose high around her. The office smelled of polish and cold air, with every detail designed to remind visitors of wealth and distance. When Reed finally appeared, her smile was thin and professional, a handshake delivered without warmth. Inside the conference room, the table stretched long and bare, with only 2 glasses of water placed at equal distance. Reed spoke in clipped sentences, her tone steady, her words sharp with calculation. She explained that Emily's sister's medical bills could be erased in a moment, and an art studio could be funded with one signature, if Emily agreed to sign a non-disclosure agreement. For a moment, Emily imagined the relief. The hospital calls ending, the weight lifted from her shoulders, the chance to finally breathe. Yet the contract on the table looked less like an escape and more like a lock. Every word was polished to hide the trap inside it, and Reed's eyes revealed no trace of care. Emily glanced at the papers, the pen waiting beside them, the quiet expectation pressing down on her. She thought of her long shifts, of her sister sleeping with monitors humming, of the silence she had endured after her note. This was not freedom. It was a gilded cage lined with favors meant to buy her silence. Her chest tightened as she leaned back in the chair, meeting Reed's gaze without lowering her eyes. Something in her refused the easy answer, the simple exit dressed up as generosity. For the first time since she had mailed that envelope, Emily felt the start of resistance stirring inside her. At 8:45 p.m., Emily left the subway and noticed a man waiting near the entrance. He was dressed too neatly for the neighborhood, his tie loose but his shoes polished. When he stepped into the light and introduced himself as Gregory Miles, his voice carried the smoothness of someone used to boardrooms. They walked to a quiet corner of the street where his words came fast, heavy with bitterness. He called Richard Blackwell a thief, a man who had stolen not only money, but legacies. Miles claimed he had watched for years as Blackwell profited from ideas that were never his. Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice. $10 million, he said. If Emily would take the story public, he promised lawyers, headlines, and a chance to tear down the empire built on her father's work. His eyes burned with something sharper than generosity, a hunger that betrayed him. Emily listened, her arms crossed against the cool night air, her chest tightening with unease. His words sounded convincing, but his posture told another story. The slight shake in his hand, the way his jaw clenched at Blackwell's name, revealed desperation, not strength. He painted himself as her ally, a man seeking justice. Yet each promise came too easily, as if rehearsed, as if she was only a tool in his plan. She realized this was not rescue. It was manipulation dressed as opportunity. For a moment she considered what 10 million could do. The medical bills erased forever, her sister secure, the chance to live without fear of the next envelope. But as Miles waited for her answer, she knew this choice would bind her to his war, not free her. She stepped back, her voice calm but steady, and told him she needed time. Miles nodded, but his eyes betrayed frustration before he turned away. Emily walked home with her heart pounding, realizing that not everyone who fought the powerful was pure in motive. At 6:30 a.m., Emily sat alone at her kitchen table with the letter from Reed and the memory of Miles pressing against her mind. The apartment was quiet, filled only with the hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of pipes. Her hands rested on the wood surface, and, for the first time in weeks, she thought about her father's voice instead of their demands. He had been an Air Force engineer, steady and methodical, the kind of man who spoke in facts but lived by values. She remembered the long evenings when he explained the importance of keeping the A-10 Thunderbolt II mission ready, how logistics kept pilots alive as much as armor or weapons. His words had always returned to one truth: integrity mattered more than power. Emily closed her eyes and pictured the blueprints he used to spread across the dining table. She recalled him pointing out the smallest details in supply chains and aircraft systems, reminding her that shortcuts could cost lives. He never sought praise. He believed doing the job right was its own reward. Now she understood why both Reed and Miles made her uneasy. Their offers were shortcuts wrapped in temptation, ways to trade silence or betrayal for comfort. None of it matched the lessons that had been drilled into her life. Her chest tightened, but not from fear this time. She felt resolve building where uncertainty had lived. If Blackwell wanted her silence and Miles wanted her outrage, then she would demand something else. Emily reached for her phone, her fingers steady, and typed out a message that cut through all the noise. She requested a direct meeting with Richard Blackwell himself. No lawyers, no middlemen, no whispered deals. When she pressed send, she sat back and breathed deeply. It was not relief, but strength. She was no longer waiting for others to decide her fate. She was stepping forward, choosing her own ground, and for the first time since it all began, Emily felt ready to face him. At 7:15 p.m., the car rolled north along the Hudson, its headlights cutting through the fading dusk. Emily sat in the back seat, silent, her hands folded tight as the driver turned through a set of iron gates. The estate loomed on the hill above, its windows glowing against the dark river, a fortress of glass and stone. The long driveway seemed built to impress, lined with old oaks that reached like sentinels overhead. Each turn pulled her deeper into Blackwell's world, a place carved by wealth and power. She felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, reminding her of the imbalance between them. When the car stopped, a butler opened her door and led her across polished marble floors. The house smelled faintly of cedar smoke, though every surface gleamed with steel and glass. She was ushered into a study where Blackwell sat waiting by the fire. He was older than she expected, his frame still sharp but his face worn by lines that looked carved rather than aged. For a moment, neither spoke, the fire crackling between them. Then his voice broke the silence, lower and slower than she remembered from his speeches. He confessed without ceremony. Her father's algorithm had been the foundation of his empire, the spark that carried his name across decades. He admitted he had stolen it, telling himself at the time that it was survival, that her father would never fight for credit. Emily's stomach tightened, but she held her ground. He spoke on, his tone heavy with regret, saying the weight of it had followed him through every success. He called it his greatest sin, the one truth that money could not erase. She listened, the firelight flickering against her face, torn between anger and sorrow. To hear him admit it was both vindication and pain. Her father's brilliance had been buried under another man's name. Yet at last, the truth stood in the open. Emily did not answer right away. She let the silence stretch, let him feel the gravity of his own confession. In that moment, she knew the first step to redemption was not hers to give. It had to come from him. At 8:30 a.m., sunlight spilled across the tall windows of Blackwell's study. The night before had been heavy with confession, but now his voice carried something different, a sense of resolve. Emily sat across from him, bracing for another bargain. But instead he unfolded a folder with a single name printed across the top. It read, "The David Carter Foundation for Innovation." He explained that it would honor her father's work by supporting veterans and their families in technical and creative fields. No longer would his brilliance remain buried. His ideas would serve the living, and the foundation would stand as a permanent acknowledgement. Emily listened carefully, her chest tight as the words sank in. He described scholarships for veterans learning engineering, grants for families developing new systems, and workshops where ideas could turn into solutions. Every line of his plan felt like a deliberate act of restoration. Then he turned the page, and she saw her own name. Alongside the support for her sister's medical care was an offer she had never expected, a studio of her own, a space where she could create, and a position to guide the foundation's future. Her throat caught, and for a moment she could not speak. After years of pressure and fear, here was something she had never known release. The weight of endless struggle, of carrying her father's shadow alone, began to lift. Blackwell's eyes softened as he explained that this was not repayment. It was restoration, a way to return purpose to a name that had been taken. He admitted that no money could erase the theft, but building something lasting might honor the man who had inspired it all. Emily felt tears threaten, but she steadied herself. She pictured her sister smiling in a hospital bed, secure in the care that was now possible. She imagined her father's blueprints pinned to the walls of her own space, guiding her hands as she shaped something new. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth touching her skin. For the first time since this battle began, she felt the room expand instead of close in. The silence between them was no longer hostile. It was full of possibility. She finally looked across the table and nodded, not in surrender, but in agreement. Redemption was never about money alone. It was about restoring what had been broken. And now she saw the path forward. At 9:15 a.m., sunlight streamed through tall windows, filling the new studio with a glow that made the bare walls feel alive. The air carried the scent of fresh wood and plaster, and for the first time in years, Emily felt a room was truly hers. In the center, a simple frame leaned against the wall, holding the worn $1 bill that had started it all. She lifted the frame and studied it closely. The creases, the faded ink, and the small imperfections were all intact. It was not valuable in money, but it had become priceless in meaning, the proof of how far she had come without losing herself. She hung it carefully, stepping back to see it catch the morning light. It was not a decoration, but a reminder, set above the workbench where her hands would shape new things, her father's name, her own choices, and the weight of years now lived in that quiet symbol. Turning, she reached for her sculpting tools. The familiar weight settled into her palms, steady now instead of trembling. The chisel and mallet felt like extensions of herself, ready to answer after years of silence. Her first strike on the stone rang clear, echoing through the empty studio. It was not just work. It was a return. Each motion carried the discipline her father had taught, the calm she had fought to keep, and the courage to build forward instead of looking back. She paused and looked around the room again. Sunlight cut long beams across the floor, laying paths of brightness over her workbench, the stone blocks, and the framed dollar above. The silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful, waiting for her to fill it. For the first time, she felt both endings and beginnings living side by side. The empire built on theft was now reshaped into something that could give back. Her sister would have care. Her father's brilliance was honored. And she had her place to create again. The dollar had not changed her life. What had changed everything was her grace, her refusal to give bitterness the final word. It was proof that character, not circumstance, defined destiny. In a quiet moment, her voice could almost be heard as if carried on film, a final reflection spoken over the scene. What would you do with a single dollar that tested your character? The question hung there, an invitation to everyone listening.